Welcome to Mr. Kellen's Stories, my amazing YouTube family. This story is filled with suspense, emotions, and moments that will melt your heart. Stay till the end. You won't regret it. If you love thrilling, emotional, and unforgettable stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy this incredible journey. The storm raged through the night like an untamed beast, winds howling as if nature itself had turned against the small town. Sheets of rain pounded against car windows, distorting the bright neon signs of the roadside buildings. Lightning crackled across the sky, illuminating the soaked streets for brief, eerie moments before plunging them back into darkness. Lucas Reed gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black Mercedes, his sharp blue eyes scanning the blurry road ahead. The CEO of Reed Enterprises, he was a man who thrived in chaos. But this was something else. He had planned to take his private jet back to New York that evening, but the storm had other ideas. The airport was shut down, and all flights had been grounded indefinitely. Frustration clawed at him, but he remained composed. There was no point in fighting nature. His GPS blinked erratically before rerouting. Recalculating. Nearest hotel. Willow Creek Inn, 2 miles ahead. Lucas exhaled sharply and turned onto a narrow road. A small-town inn. It wasn't exactly his usual 5-star accommodation, but for tonight it would have to do. As he pulled into the parking lot, he noted the lack of available spaces. Cars were crammed into every spot, an indication that he wasn't the only traveler stranded. His jaw tightened. This isn't a good sign. He stepped out of his car, immediately hit by the biting cold. The rain soaked through his tailored suit within seconds, the icy wind cutting through him. He didn't care. He just needed a room and a few hours of sleep before figuring out his next move. Pushing through the heavy wooden doors of Willow Creek Inn, he was met with the warm scent of cinnamon and the crackling of a fireplace. The lobby was small, cozy, with dark wooden furniture and old-fashioned paintings hanging on the walls. Lucas strode toward the reception desk, where a young woman with tired eyes and a nervous smile stood. She glanced up and immediately straightened her posture. "Welcome to Willow Creek Inn. How can I help you?" "I need a room," Lucas said, pulling out his black AMEX card. "Any room will do." The receptionist hesitated, glancing at the monitor. Lucas didn't like hesitation. It usually meant bad news. "Sir, we are almost fully booked." She trailed off. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "Almost," he pressed. "You mean there's still one room left?" Before she could answer, the doors behind him burst open with a gust of wind, and a woman rushed inside, her heels clicking urgently against the tile floor. Lucas turned slightly, his gaze landing on her. She was drenched, rainwater dripping from her dark curls onto her expensive-looking dress. Her coat clung to her frame, emphasizing her curves, but what caught his attention the most was the fire in her brown eyes. Despite looking exhausted, she held her head high, as if she were used to commanding attention. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, her voice smooth yet laced with urgency. "Please tell me you have a room." Lucas's stomach sank. The receptionist's nervous expression returned. Well, there's only one room left." Silence blanketed the room. Lucas exhaled slowly, feeling an unexpected tension settle between him and the mysterious woman. He didn't know her, yet they were suddenly thrown into a situation neither of them wanted. Ava folded her arms. "There must be another option." "I wish there were," the receptionist sighed, "but the storm has stranded dozens of people here. Every other hotel in town is booked solid." Lucas pinched the bridge of his nose. This was not how his night was supposed to go. "I don't share rooms," he said firmly. Ava scoffed. "Neither do I." Their glares met. Two strangers, both stubborn, both unwilling to compromise. But the storm outside raged on, uncaring of their dilemma. The receptionist, clearly uncomfortable, cleared her throat. "Look, I understand this is not ideal, but this is the only option. The room has a king-sized bed, a couch, and enough space for you both to stay comfortable. It's either this or sleeping in your car." Lucas clenched his jaw. Sleeping in his car wasn't an option. He had back-to-back meetings in the morning, and the last thing he needed was a stiff neck. Ava let out a deep sigh, glancing out the window at the relentless storm. Finally, she turned back toward him. "Fine, but don't get any ideas, Mr. CEO." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Trust me, miss." He paused. Ava Williams. "Trust me, Miss Williams. I have zero interest in sharing a room either, but let's be adults about this." Ava rolled her eyes but said nothing. Lucas turned back to the receptionist and handed over his card. "We'll take the room." As the receptionist processed the payment, Ava muttered under her breath, "This is going to be a long night." Lucas couldn't help but agree. Neither of them knew just how much this one night would change everything. The door creaked open as Lucas and Ava stepped inside, the dim yellow glow from the hallway spilling into the small hotel room. The moment they crossed the threshold, an undeniable tension thickened the air. Lucas, ever the composed businessman, took in the surroundings with a single glance. The room was cozy, which was a polite way of saying small. The bed, a king size, dominated the space, while a single narrow couch was pushed against the far wall. A nightstand sat between them, holding an outdated alarm clock and a hotel-issued lamp with a flickering bulb. Lucas ran a hand down his face. "This is ridiculous." Ava, on the other hand, silently observed the situation. She wasn't thrilled either. The idea of sharing a space with a stranger, no matter how good-looking or wealthy, wasn't exactly comforting. Lucas exhaled sharply. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals, handled boardroom crises, and commanded respect from the most ruthless executives. Yet here he was, stuck in a too-small room with a woman who clearly had no interest in being anywhere near him. "I'll take the couch," Lucas said, his voice carrying the same authority he used in the corporate world. Ava barely looked at him. She gave a half-shrug, disinterest etched across her delicate features. "Fine by me." Lucas arched an eyebrow. He wasn't used to people dismissing him so easily. Most people tried to impress him, tried to win his favor. But Ava, she was indifferent. She didn't care who he was. And for some reason that irritated him. Still, he wasn't about to dwell on it. He set his suitcase down and removed his soaked blazer, draping it over a chair. His crisp white shirt clung slightly to his frame from the rain, and he rolled his sleeves up to his elbows, revealing toned forearms. Ava ignored him completely. She had already slipped off her heels, shaking the water from her long curls before reaching for a towel from the bathroom. Lucas noted how she moved with quiet elegance, but there was something else beneath the surface, something guarded. She wasn't just annoyed, she was distant, like someone who had learned to build walls high enough to keep people out. Lucas wasn't one to pry, but something about her intrigued him. They spent the next hour pretending the other didn't exist. Lucas settled onto the couch, scrolling through his phone, mentally reviewing his meetings for the next day, meetings that now seemed far away thanks to this damn storm. Ava, on the other hand, sat on the edge of the bed, drying her hair with a towel. Every now and then she glanced at her own phone, her fingers hovering over the screen as if debating whether to call someone. But she never did. Lucas noticed. "You're awfully quiet," he commented, not looking up from his phone. Ava shot him a look. "So are you." Lucas smirked. "I'm a businessman. I thrive in silence. And I'm a woman trying to get some sleep. So if you don't mind," she gestured toward the bed, "I'd like to do just that." Lucas let out a low chuckle. Fair enough. He adjusted himself on the couch, folding his arms behind his head. The fabric was rough, and the cushions were thin. not at all what he was used to. This was going to be a long night. Ava, meanwhile, slipped under the covers of the bed, turning her back to him. The room fell into silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. For a moment, it seemed like they would get through the night without any more complications. Then, just as Lucas started to relax, the power went out. The room was plunged into pitch-black silence. The humming of the heater stopped. The dim bedside lamp flickered once before dying completely. Ava sucked in a sharp breath. Lucas sat up instantly, his CEO instincts kicking in. Something about complete darkness always felt suffocating. "Great," Ava muttered. "Just what we needed." Lucas's phone screen provided the only source of light, casting a faint glow over the room. "Power outage. Probably the storm," he said. Ava didn't respond. Lucas frowned, glancing toward the bed. She was completely still, her breathing slightly uneven. He narrowed his eyes. "You okay?" Still, no answer. That's when he noticed it, the slight tremble of her hands. She wasn't just annoyed by the power outage, she was scared. Lucas put his phone down and stood up, moving cautiously toward the bed. "Ava," he said, softer this time. She snapped out of her trance, sitting up too quickly. She was breathing too fast. Lucas frowned. "You're not afraid of the dark, are you?" Ava blinked rapidly, as if trying to mask her reaction. It's just... I don't like unexpected blackouts," she said, her voice quieter than before. But Lucas wasn't an idiot. He knew when someone was lying. She wasn't afraid of the dark itself. She was afraid of what the darkness reminded her of. Lucas hesitated, torn between respecting her space and acknowledging what he saw. He wasn't used to this, comforting someone. His world revolved around business, power, control. Not emotional vulnerability, but something about Ava's reaction. It unsettled him. Without overthinking, he grabbed his phone and switched on the flashlight, aiming it at the ceiling so it wouldn't shine directly on her. "Here," he said simply. "It's not much, but it's better than total darkness." Ava exhaled, the tension in her shoulders loosening slightly. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Lucas could tell from the way her breathing slowed that she appreciated it. They sat there for a moment, two strangers forced together by circumstance, sharing an unexpected understanding. Neither of them spoke, but the room no longer felt quite as suffocating. Lucas leaned back against the couch again, still watching her out of the corner of his eye. Maybe this night wasn't just a disaster after all. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to Ava Williams than she was willing to let him see. And for the first time that night, Lucas wasn't just annoyed by their situation, he was curious. The storm raged outside, sending relentless gusts of wind rattling against the hotel windows. Rain lashed at the glass like ghostly fingers, and thunder rolled through the night, deep and unsettling. Inside the dimly lit hotel room, the only source of light was Ava's phone screen, its faint glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. Lucas sat on the edge of the couch, his sharp eyes trained on her. She was trembling. At first, he thought it was just the cold, but no, this was different. Her fingers were wrapped tightly around her phone, knuckles white. Her breathing was uneven. Lucas, always a man of logic and control, found himself doing something he rarely did. He softened. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice devoid of its usual sharpness. Ava hesitated, as if debating whether to answer truthfully. Then she exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly. "I just don't like the dark," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas frowned. He had met all kinds of people, ruthless executives, desperate businessmen, charming con artists. But none of them had ever looked the way Ava did right now, vulnerable, guarded, afraid, not just of the dark, of something deeper. Instead of prying, he grabbed his phone and switched on the flashlight again, angling it toward the ceiling so it cast a warm glow over the room. The small act seemed to make a difference. Ava's shoulders relaxed just a little, and for the first time that night, she really looked at him. Not with irritation, not with indifference, but with something else, something unspoken. Lucas held her gaze, an unfamiliar sensation settling in his chest. He was used to reading people, analyzing their weaknesses, figuring out what made them tick. But Ava? She was a puzzle he hadn't solved yet, and for some reason he wanted to. Just as the silence between them started to feel less uncomfortable, a sudden, loud bang echoed from the hallway. Lucas's body went rigid. Ava gasped, her phone slipping slightly in her grasp. It wasn't just the wind. It sounded like a door slamming shut. Lucas was on his feet in an instant, his senses sharp. His mind, trained to assess threats in high-stakes business negotiations, instantly shifted into protective mode. "Stay here," he ordered, his tone firm as he stepped toward the door. Ava reacted faster than he expected. Before he could move, her fingers wrapped around his wrist, gripping him tightly. "No," she whispered urgently, her voice laced with something he hadn't heard before. Fear. Lucas looked down at her, surprised by the intensity in her eyes. "Something doesn't feel right," she added, her grip tightening. Lucas had learned long ago to trust his instincts, but right now, his instincts were telling him to trust hers. Because this wasn't just about a power outage. Ava wasn't just afraid of the dark. She was afraid of something, or someone. Lucas studied her, noting the way she kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any second. "Ava," he said carefully, lowering his voice, "what aren't you telling me?" She hesitated, but her silence spoke volumes. There was something off about this whole situation, the way she reacted to the blackout, the way she froze at the sound of the door, the way she was gripping him now. It wasn't normal. Lucas had spent years in boardrooms, mastering the art of reading people. Right now, Ava wasn't just reacting to the storm. She was reacting to a memory, a bad one. Finally, she exhaled shakily. "It's nothing," she mumbled, pulling her hand away as if realizing she had grabbed him in the first place. Lucas clenched his jaw. Lies. But before he could push further, another sound echoed from the hallway, this time lighter. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Ava went pale. Lucas didn't hesitate this time. He grabbed his phone and marched toward the door, determination in every step. "Lucas!" Ava hissed, but he ignored her. Who the hell else would be walking around a dark hotel at this hour? He pressed his ear against the wooden door, his body tense. The footsteps had stopped. He reached for the doorknob, but Ava yanked him back, her nails digging into his arm. "Don't," she whispered fiercely. "Please." Lucas turned, startled by the sheer urgency in her voice. He had never seen a woman look more serious in his life. Ava was genuinely terrified. For a long moment, the two of them stood frozen in place, the only sound between them their uneven breathing and the storm raging outside. Then, without warning, 3 slow knocks sounded against their door. Ava's fingers tightened on his arm. Lucas's mind raced. Why would someone be knocking at their door during a power outage? No hotel staff would be moving through dark hallways in the middle of a storm just to check on guests. And if it was another stranded traveler, wouldn't they have called out first? Instead, whoever was on the other side stood in complete silence. Lucas took a slow, deep breath. Think logically. Stay calm. He turned his phone's flashlight off, plunging the room back into darkness. Ava inhaled sharply, but she didn't protest. Lucas listened. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, another knock. Ava tensed. Lucas's pulse quickened, but he kept his face unreadable. "Who's there?" he finally called out. His voice was steady, controlled. Silence. His grip on his phone tightened. Then, footsteps, not walking away, but pacing, back and forth, right outside their door. Lucas's jaw clenched. He didn't scare easily, but this was unsettling. Ava wrapped her arms around herself, her entire body tense. Lucas caught the movement, and something in his chest twisted. He wasn't sure what was happening tonight, but one thing was clear. Ava Williams was hiding something, and whatever it was, it had just found them. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, rain hammering against the windows in rhythmic bursts. The power remained out, leaving the hotel shrouded in eerie silence, interrupted only by distant thunder. Inside the room, the dim glow from Lucas's phone barely illuminated Ava's face, but he could still see it, the tension in her features, the way her hands trembled just slightly. Lucas wasn't a fool. He had spent years in the corporate world, surrounded by people who smiled with sharp teeth and spoke with hidden agendas. He knew how to read people, how to spot lies, fears, and the things they didn't want to say. And right now, Ava wasn't just uncomfortable. She was scared. Of what, he wasn't sure, but he was about to find out. Lucas leaned back against the couch, folding his arms across his chest. "Why do I feel like you're not just any traveler?" he asked, his voice even but probing. Ava tensed, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket she had pulled over herself. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she exhaled, as if releasing a secret she had been holding in for too long. "Because I'm not," she whispered. Lucas's brows drew together, his sharp instincts immediately locked onto the truth beneath her words. Ava wasn't just some stranded woman caught in a storm. She was running, and whoever she was running from had left a shadow behind that still clung to her. Lucas didn't push her. Instead, he waited, because when people are truly afraid, silence is louder than any question. Sure enough, after a few beats, Ava spoke again. This time, her voice barely above the sound of the storm outside. "I was supposed to disappear tonight. No one was supposed to find me." Lucas's fingers curled slightly at his sides. "Disappear," he echoed. Ava nodded, her expression distant, like she was remembering something she didn't want to. "I've been trying to leave for months," she admitted, "but he won't let me." Lucas's stomach tightened. He had seen this story before. Women trapped in situations they couldn't escape, power wielded like a weapon, fear that lived under the skin, making a home in the bones. "Who?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Ava hesitated. Then finally, she whispered the name like it was a curse. "Daniel Cross." Lucas stilled. He knew that name. Everyone in the business world knew that name. Daniel Cross wasn't just powerful, he was ruthless. The kind of man who collected people like assets, who crushed anyone who got in his way. If Ava was running from him, then this wasn't just a case of a broken relationship. This was a case of survival. For the first time since they had met, Lucas looked at Ava differently, not as an inconvenience, not as a woman forced to share his space, but as someone who was fighting for her freedom, and suddenly he understood her. Maybe not in the way she had suffered, but in another way, one that was uniquely his own. Because Lucas knew what it was like to be chased, not by a man like Cross, but by expectations, by pressure, by a world that never lets you rest. People thought being a CEO meant power, control, security, but in reality, it meant living in a cage of responsibilities. The storm outside howled with relentless fury, but inside the dimly lit hotel room, the real storm was just beginning. Lucas barely had a second to process Ava's confession, her fear, her desperation, her escape, before a loud, forceful knock shattered the fragile silence. Bang, bang, bang! Ava's entire body went rigid. Then, "Ava, I know you're in there." The voice was deep, smooth, too calm. The kind of calm that sent ice down Lucas's spine. Ava turned pale. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Lucas's instinct sharpened instantly. He didn't need to know the details. He already knew exactly what this was. This was the past catching up, This was danger. Lucas moved before he could think. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, shielding Ava with his body. "Who is that?" he demanded, his voice low but edged with authority. Ava's breath was shaky, uneven. "Someone I never wanted to see again," she whispered. Lucas didn't need more than that. Whoever was standing on the other side of that door wasn't just an inconvenience. He was a threat. And Lucas Reed did not back down from threats. He turned his head slightly, catching the way Ava's hands trembled at her sides. Without thinking, he reached back and grabbed her hand. Her fingers were ice cold, her grip weak at first, until he gave her a slight squeeze. Then, slowly, her grip tightened around his. Lucas wasn't sure why that mattered, but it did. The knocking came again, harder this time. "Ava, open the door. You know running was a mistake." Lucas clenched his jaw, his free hand curling into a fist. Whoever this was, he spoke like he owned her, like Ava was some object that had slipped through his fingers. Lucas had spent his entire career dealing with men like this, entitled, controlling, dangerous. "If you don't open up, I will," the voice added, voice deceptively smooth. Lucas's eyes flicked toward Ava. She was terrified. Not just anxious, not just startled, but terrified in a way that spoke of past wounds, of nights filled with shadows and whispers she couldn't escape. Lucas exhaled, forcing his voice to stay controlled. "Get away from the door." Silence. Then, a dark chuckle. "And who the hell are you?" The voice sneered. Lucas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The man standing between you and her." Ava's grip on his hand tightened. The air between them felt charged, electric with tension and unspoken promises. Lucas didn't know Ava well, but in this moment she was his to protect, and he didn't lose battles. The man on the other side of the door shifted. Lucas could hear it, the sound of someone stepping closer, pressing a palm against the wood. "Ava, don't do this," the voice tried again, softer this time. "You don't have to run. You know I'd take care of you." Ava flinched. Lucas nearly saw red. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said firmly. A slow sigh. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, businessman," the voice warned. "You think you can protect her? From me?" Lucas tilted his head slightly, his confidence unshaken. "I don't think. I know." Silence. Then, the sound of something scraping against the door. Ava sucked in a breath, and Lucas felt her grip on him tighten like a lifeline. "Fine," the voice finally said, cold and sharp. "Have it your way." And then, the footsteps retreated. Slow, calculated. But Lucas wasn't stupid. This wasn't over, not even close. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Lucas waited, listening, ensuring the footsteps faded completely. Only when he was certain the man was gone, at least for now, did he turn to Ava. "He's not done," Lucas said, his voice lower now, calmer. Ava nodded, swallowing hard. She knew that too. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice broke on the first syllable. Then, to his surprise, she stumbled. Lucas caught her instantly, his arms strong around her shoulders as he steadied her. Her breath came out in shallow gasps, and for the first time he realized she wasn't just scared. She was exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally. She had been running for so long, and now, finally, she had stopped. Lucas held her up, his hands firm but careful. "You're safe," he said softly. Ava let out a short, bitter laugh. "That's what they all say," she whispered. Lucas stilled, because something in her tone told him no one had ever truly made her safe before. But he wasn't they, and he didn't make promises he couldn't keep. So he looked her dead in the eye and said the words no one else ever had. "Then let me be the first to mean it." Lucas guided Ava to the bed, making her sit before kneeling in front of her. "How long have you been running?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. Then, too long. Lucas nodded, pressing his lips together. He glanced toward the door, then back at her. "He's going to come back," he warned. Ava looked down at her hands, at the small tremors still running through them. "I know." Lucas exhaled, his mind already working through 1,000 solutions, 1,000 strategies. This was no longer just a stormy night in a hotel. This was a battle, and Lucas Reed had never lost a battle in his life. Ava finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Lucas didn't have an answer, at least not one he was ready to say out loud. But deep down, he knew the truth. Because for the first time in his life, a deal didn't matter, a contract didn't matter, a business merger didn't matter, only she did, and that terrified him more than anything. The tension in the room was suffocating. Lucas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he kept his gaze locked on the door. The man outside. Ava's past, her nightmare, wasn't gone for good. He was waiting for the right moment to strike. And Lucas knew one thing for certain. The door wouldn't hold. Lucas had spent years making decisions in high-stakes boardrooms. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals, faced ruthless competitors, and built an empire with his sharp mind and unshakable instincts. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was survival. And for the first time, he wasn't making a decision for profit. He was making a decision for her. Lucas took a step closer to Ava, keeping his voice low and firm. "We have to get out of here," he murmured. Ava's wide, fearful eyes snapped to his. For a split second she hesitated because running hadn't saved her before. But then something flickered in her gaze. "Trust." She nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Lucas exhaled, relieved she wasn't going to fight him on this. Then, without wasting another second, he turned to the window. Rain poured relentlessly outside, the storm still raging. The wind howled, rattling the thin glass panes. It was risky, climbing down in a storm onto unfamiliar ground with no clear escape route. But Lucas had no other choice, because they were out of time. Lucas reached for the window latch, pushing it open with a sharp creak. Cold wind and rain blasted into the room, drenching them instantly. He didn't even flinch, but Ava did. And then the door shuddered violently, as if someone had thrown their full weight against it. Ava gasped, her whole body going stiff. Lucas reacted instantly. He grabbed her hand and yanked her toward the window. "Now!" he ordered. "Go!" But before she could move, the door burst open. A shadowy figure stormed into the room. Lucas barely caught a glimpse. Tall, broad, dark clothing clinging to his frame from the rain. His face was mostly hidden by shadows, but his presence was unmistakable, predatory, controlling, dangerous. "Ava." The voice was smooth, but it carried something far more sinister beneath it. Ava flinched like she had been struck. Lucas didn't wait to see what would happen next. In one swift motion, he pulled Ava toward him and shoved her toward the open window. "Go!" he barked. She didn't argue. With trembling fingers, she gripped the edge of the window frame and climbed out into the storm. Lucas turned back just in time to see the man take a step closer. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The man sneered. Lucas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The man you won't catch," he replied smoothly. And then, before the intruder could react, Lucas turned and jumped out the window after Ava. The rain hit them in sheets, soaking them as they landed in the narrow alley behind the hotel. Lucas steadied Ava as she stumbled slightly, then grabbed her wrist and pulled her into a full sprint. "Where?" she tried to ask between breaths. "Just run," Lucas commanded. And she did. Their shoes splashed through puddles, their breath came in sharp gasps, and the sound of footsteps behind them sent pure adrenaline surging through Lucas's veins. The intruder wasn't far behind. Lucas took a sharp turn, leading Ava down a back street. The town was small, its streets narrow and twisting, and the storm made everything harder to see. "This way," he urged. Ava didn't question him. She held onto his hand and followed. Lightning cracked across the sky, briefly illuminating their surroundings. That's when Lucas spotted it, a small, abandoned building up ahead, its door slightly ajar, a perfect hiding spot. "In there," he said, tugging Ava toward it. She hesitated only for a second before nodding. They slipped inside, their bodies pressed against the wall as they tried to quiet their breathing. Outside, the footsteps grew louder, then slowed. Lucas could feel Ava's heartbeat pounding against his arm. They held their breath as the figure stopped just outside the building. Seconds stretched into eternity. And then the footsteps kept moving. Ava let out a silent exhale. Lucas didn't let go of her hand, because somehow it felt wrong to. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued beating against the roof, the storm unrelenting. Ava finally looked up at him, her face still pale, her lips parted as if trying to form words. She started, but her voice cracked. Lucas tilted his head slightly, studying her. This was a woman who had spent months, maybe years, running. And for the first time, she wasn't running alone. Lucas wasn't sure what this meant. He wasn't sure why he cared so damn much, but what he did know was he wasn't letting her face this alone. Not anymore. They weren't safe yet. The night wasn't over. But as Ava looked at him, not with fear, but with something softer, something he couldn't quite name, Lucas knew one thing for certain. He would fight for her. He would protect her, no matter what. The storm raged on outside, but inside the small, forgotten storage shed, time seemed to slow. Ava stood near the wall, her soaked clothes clinging to her frame, her chest rising and falling with every shaky breath. Lucas wasn't much better. His dress shirt was drenched, sticking to his skin, but the cold didn't bother him. What did bother him? The way Ava's hands trembled, the way her eyes darted around the tiny space, like she was still waiting for a monster to emerge from the shadows. She had been running for so long, and Lucas hated that he had no idea how to fix this. Lucas took a slow step toward her, his expression unreadable. "You need to tell me everything." Ava's shoulders tensed, her breath hitching. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer, but then she exhaled shakily, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Marcus." The name alone made Lucas's stomach twist with something dark. "I used to work for him," Ava continued, hugging herself as if trying to keep from falling apart. "At first, he was just my boss. Demanding, ruthless, but nothing out of the ordinary." She laughed bitterly. "Then one day I said no." Lucas froze. He didn't need to ask what she meant. He already knew, and he didn't take no for an answer. Lucas had seen monsters in business, men who preyed on weakness, men who thought power meant control, men like Marcus, his fists clenched. "How long?" he asked, his voice low. Controlled Ava swallowed hard. 2 years. 2 years of running, 2 years of looking over her shoulder, 2 years of never feeling safe. Lucas felt a sharp, unfamiliar anger burn in his chest. Ava had been living in fear, and Marcus had kept living his life as if he hadn't stolen hers. Lucas had spent his entire career fighting for control, but this wasn't about business. This was about a woman who had been stripped of hers. And that was something he couldn't ignore. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside of him. "He'll never stop, will he?" Ava shook her head. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Lucas didn't know what surprised him more, her fear or her strength, because even though she was terrified, even though she had spent 2 years running, she was still standing, and somehow she was still fighting. Lucas had built his empire on power. Ava had built her survival on resilience, and in that moment he realized she was the strongest person he had ever met. Lucas slowly stepped closer. Not enough to scare her, not enough to push, just enough to let her know he wasn't going anywhere. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Ava stiffened, blinking up at him. "I don't—" She hesitated. "I don't want to drag you into this." Lucas let out a humorless laugh. Too late. Ava searched his face, as if trying to find a reason to not believe him, but Lucas had made up his mind. He wasn't leaving her to fight this battle alone. He didn't care what it cost. Because some fights weren't about power. Some fights were about doing what was right, and Lucas had never been more certain of anything in his life. The storm outside was unforgiving. Wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the fragile wooden walls of the small, abandoned storage shed. Rain dripped from the gaps in the ceiling, creating shallow puddles on the uneven floor. Lucas's expensive dress shoes were soaked, his once crisp shirt clinging to his body like a second skin. But none of it mattered. Not the rain, not the cold, not the discomfort, because right now his focus was entirely on her. Ava stood in the corner, arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she could hold her broken pieces together. Her soaked dress stuck to her frame, her dark hair dripping like ink against her pale skin. She looked fragile, but Lucas knew better. This wasn't a woman who shattered easily. This was a woman who had been breaking for years, but had never once fallen apart. And that realization, it did something to him. Lucas ran a hand through his damp hair, exhaling sharply. "You need to tell me everything." Ava flinched at the words, not physically, but in her eyes. For the first time, Lucas saw something in her gaze that had nothing to do with fear. It was hesitation, like she wasn't sure if she should let him in, but he wasn't giving her a choice. "Ava," his voice softened, but his resolve didn't. "If I don't know what we're dealing with, I can't protect you." She swallowed, her throat working painfully against the silence. And then, finally, she spoke. "His name is Marcus." Lucas's entire body went still. Marcus. The name itself felt wrong, like it carried the weight of something rotting beneath the surface. Ava let out a shaky breath, shifting her gaze away. "I used to work for him," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first, he was just another demanding boss, ruthless, cold, but nothing I couldn't handle." Lucas narrowed his eyes. He had met men like Marcus before, powerful men who thought the world belonged to them. But there was something darker in Ava's tone, something that made his stomach tighten. "And then," he pressed. Ava laughed bitterly. "Then I told him no." Lucas's fists clenched so hard his knuckles went white. He understood now, and he hated it. "He didn't take no for an answer," Ava whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. Lucas didn't move, didn't breathe, because if he did, he might not be able to stop himself from punching something, or someone. Ava was still talking, but her voice sounded far away. "At first it was small things. He'd change my schedule, cancel my meetings, send gifts I never wanted. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was imagining things." Her hands clenched into shaking fists. "But then it got worse. The way he looked at me changed, like I wasn't a person anymore. Like I was—" She trailed off, swallowing hard. "A possession," Lucas finished for her. Ava met his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't try to hide. Yes. Lucas inhaled deeply, trying to suppress the fury boiling in his veins. He had spent his entire life building power from nothing. He had fought, clawed, and bled to be respected in a world that only cared about money and dominance. But this kind of power, the kind Marcus had used to strip Ava of her safety, her choices, her freedom, it was something Lucas despised. "How long has he been chasing you?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Ava hesitated. 2 years. Lucas closed his eyes for a second. 2 years. 2 years of running, 2 years of hiding, 2 years of never feeling safe. And yet, she had survived. Ava Williams wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter, and Lucas had never met anyone stronger. Lucas took a slow step toward her, careful not to startle her. "He'll never stop, will he?" Ava's lips trembled. She didn't have to answer. They both knew the truth. Marcus wasn't the kind of man who walked away, not until he had destroyed what he couldn't control. Lucas exhaled slowly, then reached out and tipped Ava's chin up with 2 fingers. She stiffened slightly, but she didn't pull away. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he murmured. Ava's eyes widened. "I don't," she faltered. "I don't want to drag you into this." Lucas let out a humorless chuckle. Too late. Ava searched his face, as if trying to find a reason not to trust him, but Lucas had already made his decision. He wasn't letting Marcus win. He wasn't letting Ava fight this war alone. Some fights weren't about power or money. Some fights were about doing what was right, and Lucas Reed, he had never lost a fight in his life. The wind slammed against the shed, rattling the wooden walls. They weren't safe yet, not even close. But for the first time in a long time, Ava wasn't running alone. And Lucas wasn't about to let the storm take her. Not now. Lucas wasn't a hero. He had spent his entire life fighting battles in boardrooms, crushing competition, and building an empire that answered to no one. But tonight? Tonight wasn't about business. It was about justice. It was about Ava. And he wasn't going to let Marcus win. Lucas pulled out his phone, fingers moving with calculated precision. "I need backup," he said, his voice calm but lethal. There was no hesitation in the response. Lucas had powerful connections, the kind of connections Marcus never expected him to use, not for this, not for her. But Lucas wasn't the kind of man who let monsters roam free, not on his watch. The storm had slowed, but tension still clung to the air. Ava stood beside him, watching as he made call after call. "What are you doing?" she finally asked, voice hesitant. Lucas glanced at her, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Ending this." Ava blinked. She had spent years running, years believing there was no way out. But here was a man who wasn't running, a man who wasn't afraid, and for the first time in forever, she felt something strange. Hope. The hotel lobby was eerily silent when they walked in. Lucas's presence was commanding, his strides powerful. Ava followed, her heartbeat a drum against her ribs. And then, he was there. Marcus stood in the center of the lobby, waiting, smirking. The sight of him made Ava's breath hitch, her fingers curling into fists. The man who had stolen her peace, the man who had chased her through cities, through years, through nightmares. He was just standing there, like he still owned her, like he always would. Lucas noticed the way her body tensed. Without thinking, he stepped closer. His arm brushed against hers, not restraining, not demanding, just there. A silent message. "You're not alone anymore." Marcus's smirk widened. "Ava," he drawled, "you can't run forever." Ava stiffened, but Lucas laughed, a slow, amused, dangerous chuckle. Marcus's expression faltered, just for a second. Lucas tilted his head, eyes dark with something unreadable. Who said she was the one running? And then, chaos. The hotel doors burst open. A wave of uniformed officers and private security flooded the lobby. Marcus's smirk vanished. He spun around, eyes darting between the officers and the man he had underestimated. "What the hell is this?" he snapped. Lucas stepped forward, his voice cold, unforgiving. "This is the part where you lose." Marcus turned to Ava, his face twisting in anger. You think this changes anything? He spat. I own people in this city. One phone call and— You own nothing, Lucas cut in. His voice was calm, but the authority behind it was absolute. Not her, not your power, not your freedom. It's over. And as the officers stepped forward, Marcus finally realized he had lost. Marcus fought. Of course he did. Men like him always thought they could fight their way out. But tonight was different. Tonight there was no escape. With his hands twisted behind his back, his mouth still spewing threats, Marcus was dragged away from her and Ava. Ava stood frozen, her breath shallow, her mind trying to process the impossible. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't looking over her shoulder, waiting for the nightmare to start again. She was free. A shuddering breath escaped her lips, and suddenly the weight of years came crashing down. Her knees buckled, and before she could fall, Lucas was there. He caught her easily, strong arms steadying her as she trembled. It's over, he murmured. Ava's fingers dug into his shirt. She felt like she was drowning in relief, in exhaustion, in emotions she couldn't even name. She had dreamed of this moment. She had imagined it 1,000 different ways, but never like this. Never with someone standing beside her. Never with a man who had chosen to fight for her when no one else did. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a gratitude too deep for words. Lucas just held her gaze, his own expression unreadable. Then, in a voice soft but firm, he said the only thing that mattered. You're safe now. And for the first time in years, she believed it. The sky was no longer angry. The storm that had raged through the night was now a memory, leaving behind a crisp morning air that smelled of wet pavement and something fresh, something like a new beginning. Sunlight filtered through the hotel lobby's large windows, casting golden rays across the polished floor. The storm had passed, and so had her fear. Ava stood near the entrance, arms folded loosely across her chest, staring at the world outside. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't waiting for Marcus's shadow to appear. She was free, and it felt strange. Behind her, the faint sound of footsteps approached, steady and controlled. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Lucas, the man who had stepped into her chaos without hesitation. The man who had stood between her and her worst nightmare. The man who had fought for her when no one else ever had. He stopped beside her, silent for a moment. The weight of the past lingered between them, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was just there. Part of the story, but not the end of it. I don't know how to thank you. The words came out quieter than Ava intended, but they carried everything she felt. Lucas turned to her, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. How about you promise to stay safe? Ava chuckled. A real laugh, not one forced by fear or exhaustion. It sounded strange even to her own ears, like she was finally remembering what it felt like to be herself. I think I can do that, she murmured, tilting her head slightly toward him. Their eyes met, and for the first time since the chaos of the night before, Ava allowed herself to truly look at him. Not as a powerful CEO, not as the man who had saved her, just as Lucas. And what she saw made something inside her chest tighten. There was understanding in his gaze, respect, but something else too, something unspoken. Lucas wasn't a man who rushed things. She could see it in the way he studied her, as if trying to figure out where to go from here. There was no pressure, no expectation, just possibility. Ava had spent so much of her life running, hiding, fearing. But with Lucas, she didn't feel trapped. She didn't feel like just another broken thing in need of fixing. She felt like she could finally just be. And that was something she had never thought she'd find. Lucas exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. So, what now? he asked, voice lighter than she expected. Ava shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. I guess I start over. Lucas nodded, as if he already knew that would be her answer. Good. A beat of silence. Then, but if you ever need anything. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to, because they both knew. This wasn't just a one-time rescue. This wasn't just a passing moment. This was something more, something unspoken, something worth waiting for. Ava took a deep breath, letting the morning air fill her lungs. She turned to Lucas one last time, giving him a look that held 1,000 words she wasn't ready to say yet. Thank you, Lucas. He smiled, not his usual smirk, not the confident CEO facade, just a real, quiet, honest smile. Anytime, Ava. She walked away then, stepping into the sunlight. But somehow it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them could name just yet. But some things were worth taking slow, some things needed time. And for the first time in years, Ava had all the time in the world. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt different. The once angry sky was now painted in soft shades of orange and gold, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth. The town, once drowned in the chaos of thunder and fear, now stood still, as if the night had been nothing more than a bad dream. But for Lucas and Ava, the events of the past few hours weren't something they could simply wake up from. Lucas stood at the entrance of the hotel, hands deep in his pockets, watching as the police car carrying Marcus disappeared down the slick, glistening road. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the horizon, taking with them the darkness that had haunted Ava for so long. Beside him, Ava let out a long, shaky breath, the kind of breath a person takes when they've been holding it in for years. She had spent so much of her life running, looking over her shoulder, waiting for the day Marcus would finally catch up. But now, he was gone. She was free. Lucas turned slightly, watching her. The way the morning light caught her face, the way her green eyes reflected something new, something he hadn't seen in them before. Hope. She looked up at him, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I don't know how to thank you. Lucas let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. How about you promise to stay safe? Ava smiled, but this time it wasn't forced. It wasn't the cautious, wary smile she had worn when they first met. It was real. It was hers. I think I can do that, she said. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of the night still lingering between them. But something else was there too, something unspoken, something neither of them was quite ready to name. Not yet. Ava tucked a damp strand of hair behind her ear, glancing down at her hands as she spoke. I spent so much of my life feeling powerless, she admitted, feeling like no matter what I did, someone like Marcus would always have control. Lucas listened, his chest tightening. He had never been powerless, not in the way she had been, but he understood the feeling of being trapped. His entire life had been a battle for respect, for recognition, for proving that he was more than just a wealthy businessman. Power had always been in his hands. But had he ever truly understood what it meant? He took a breath before speaking. People like Marcus exist because society allows them to. Power should never be about control. It should be about protecting those who need it. Ava looked up at him then, studying him, searching for something in his expression. And then, slowly, she nodded. I think you're one of the good ones, Lucas. Her words caught him off guard. He had spent years being called powerful, influential, successful, but no one had ever told him he was good. And somehow, those words meant more than all the others combined. She stepped forward, hesitating for just a second before placing a hand on his arm. Thank you, she whispered, and in that moment, something inside him shifted. She wasn't just a woman running from her past. She was someone stepping into a future. Lucas watched as she turned and walked away, the morning sun casting a golden glow on her, as if embracing her newfound freedom. The sight of it stirred something deep in his chest, something he couldn't quite name, but even as she left, the lesson she had given him remained. For years, Lucas had lived in a world where power meant control, where influence was measured in numbers, in deals, in wealth. But tonight he had learned something different. Power wasn't about who had the most money, the most connections, the most dominance. It was about who chose to use it for good. Marcus had used his power to manipulate, to harm, to make others feel small. And in that, Lucas saw a reflection of a much bigger problem. A world where people were judged for their skin, their gender, their background. A world where people like Ava were forced to fight for the right to simply exist freely. And that wasn't just her fight, it was his too. Because change didn't start with laws, or policies, or speeches. It started with people, with the choices they made. With men like him choosing to stand beside women like Ava, with people in power choosing to lift others up instead of tearing them down. Lucas took one last look at the hotel, at the place where everything had changed. Then, with a final glance at the sky, now clear, peaceful, and full of possibilities, he walked away, carrying a new purpose in his heart. Because in the end, true power wasn't about wealth. It was about doing what was right. As Lucas walked through the quiet streets, his mind kept replaying the night's events, the storm, the fear in Ava's eyes, the way she had trembled when she thought Marcus would take everything from her again. But she wasn't trembling now. She had walked away with her head held high, free in a way she hadn't been in years. That was what real power looked like, not control, not intimidation, but the ability to break free from those who tried to steal your choices. He had spent his whole life thinking that power meant success, money, and influence, that a man's worth was measured by the size of his empire. But tonight, his wealth and his title hadn't mattered. What had mattered was standing in front of Ava when she needed protection. What had mattered was using his power to help, not to control. He thought about Marcus, about how men like him thrived in silence, in the shadows, in a world that turned its back on victims like Ava. And he thought about himself. How many times had he ignored injustice because it wasn't his problem? How many times had he sat in boardrooms discussing numbers while women like Ava were fighting battles no one even saw? That ended today, because power wasn't just about what you built. It was about what you stood for. Lucas pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. He had spent years gathering the best minds, the most influential people. But what if he used those connections for something real? What if he created something bigger than himself? An organization, a foundation, a way to help people like Ava, people trapped, silenced, and afraid. He had money, he had power, and now he had purpose. As the first rays of sunlight stretched over the horizon, Lucas made a silent vow. He would not let this night be forgotten. He would not let Ava's story be just another tragedy. Change started with one person, and today that person was him. With determination in his steps and something new burning in his chest, Lucas Carter walked into the dawn, no longer just a CEO, but a man on a mission. Because in the end, power wasn't about what you had, it was about what you did with it. Lucas walked down the quiet street, his shoes tapping softly against the rain-slicked pavement. The night had been long, filled with danger, fear, and truths he hadn't expected to face. But now, as the first hints of dawn stretched across the sky, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: clarity. For years, he had believed power was about control, about making the right deals, leading the biggest companies, and proving himself in boardrooms filled with people who only cared about wealth. He had spent so much of his life climbing the ladder, making sure no one could ever doubt his strength, his influence. But tonight had shown him something different. Power wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It wasn't about the money in your bank account or the title before your name. It was about what you chose to do with it. He thought about Ava, about the way she had been forced to live in fear, about the way society had failed to protect her. And she wasn't the only one. There were countless people out there suffering in silence just like her, women whose voices were ignored, people who were judged by the color of their skin, by their background, by things they had no control over. Lucas had spent his life surrounded by men like Marcus, men who thought their power gave them the right to take, to hurt, to destroy. And he had never questioned it before. But now he couldn't turn a blind eye. He stopped walking and pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he made a call. "Ethan," he said when his assistant picked up, his voice firm, unwavering. "I need you to set up a meeting with my legal team first thing this morning. I have something important to discuss." "Sir, it's barely 6 a.m. "Make it happen," Lucas interrupted. He had spent his whole life building a legacy. Now it was time to build something that mattered, a foundation, a movement, a place where people like Ava could find help, protection, and justice. A place that made sure men like Marcus could never get away with their crimes again. He had money, he had influence, and he was going to use it. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he put his phone away. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As he turned to head back to his car, a voice stopped him. "Lucas." He turned, surprised to see Ava standing there. The golden light of dawn framed her, making her look almost ethereal. But it wasn't the light that made her shine. It was the quiet strength in her eyes, the strength of someone who had been through hell and survived. "You're still here," he said, stepping closer. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. I wanted to say goodbye properly." He nodded, his gaze searching hers. "Where will you go now?" Ava let out a breath, glancing at the open road ahead. "I don't know," she admitted. "But for the first time in years, I get to decide that for myself." Lucas smiled. "That's a good feeling, isn't it?" She nodded, her lips curving into a small but genuine smile. "Yeah, it is." For a moment, they just stood there, the world quiet around them. There was something unspoken between them, something deeper than gratitude, something neither of them was quite ready to name. Maybe this was the end of their story, or maybe it was just the beginning. Ava took a step back, but before she turned to leave, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Thank you, Lucas, for everything." He covered her hand with his own, giving it a small squeeze. "Take care of yourself, Ava." She nodded once, then finally turned and walked away. Lucas watched her go, his heart feeling lighter yet heavier all at once. He didn't stop her. She deserved to write her own story now, but as he got into his car and drove away, he made a promise to himself. He would make sure the world changed, even if it was one small step at a time. Because in the end, power wasn't about what you had, it was about what you chose to do with it. And Lucas Carter had finally made his choice.